Good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking item 6 in private. Item 6 is the consideration of evidence we've heard on the 2025-26 Scottish Government budget. Do we agree to take this item in private? We are agreed. Agenda item 2 is the consideration of a draft statutory instrument, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025. The instrument will make changes to the permanent cessation policy in the UK emissions trading scheme. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have made no comment on the instrument in their report. I welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy, and I also welcome from the Scottish Government officials who will be joining her. I've got Najika Nasiro, Unit Head of Net Zero Economy and Carbon Markets, Marina Cover, the Emissions Trading Schemes Team Leader, and Kenneth McDermott, Head of the Critical Energy Infrastructure. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force until the Parliament approves it. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion to recommend the instrument be approved. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not under the debate that follows. I'm now going to invite the Acting Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to everyone. Today I'm providing evidence on the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025 as an instrument to amend the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020. As you're aware, emissions trading scheme participants must purchase an allowance for each tonne of CO2 emitted. However, some allowances are given for free to sectors at risk of carbon leakage, which is when emissions are offshored, and these free allowances are currently the main policy tool to mitigate this risk. The Scottish Government, as part of the Emissions Trading Scheme Authority, is reviewing the free allocations policy. Between December 23 and March 24, we jointly consulted with other UK nations on proposals to adjust the free allocations policy to better support sectors at risk of carbon leakage. Amongst the proposals were changes to free allocation rules when operators permanently cease activities of a sub-installation, which are the amendments in today's instrument, and I'll proceed to present the proposed changes that we're proposing to make. Currently, sub-installations that permanently cease activities can retain their free allowances for the final year of operation. However, this can result in over-allocation of allowances, unintentionally allowing businesses to profit from the emissions trading scheme. Therefore, the instrument introduces new rules to ensure that businesses do not receive more free allowances than they are entitled to after permanently ceasing activities. Operators investing in decarbonisation are not penalised, and gaps on the definition of permanent cessations are addressed to prevent inconsistencies in its application. So in practice, the changes mean that the rules would mean that operators permanently ceasing activities will report emissions for the final year, allowing regulators to align free allocations with actual emissions and reclaim over-allocated allowances. To support decarbonisation efforts, an exemption will apply to operators whose sub-installations permanently cease activities as part of changes that materially reduce the carbon intensity of production, such as electrification of plants, ensuring that free allocations policy effectively supports decarbonisation efforts. And lastly, the instrument also updates the definition of permanent cessations, particularly addressing situations where temporary cessations become permanent, ensuring clarity and consistency in the allocation process. And it's important to note that once this instrument comes into force, changes will apply to all operators. And the new rules are designed to ensure fairness and accuracy in free allocation distribution, ensuring support is targeted to those sectors at risk of carbon leakage. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. First question from me. Where a plant is ceasing operations and those operations are transferred to another plant, which may slightly increase their carbon output, how's that been taken into account?
Well, the allocations are for a particular plant, so each plant would have their own allocations. So I'm trying to think of a scenario where that would happen, but I mean the allocations are for the plant. So if for example, another plant started doing the operations associated with another plant, that would be that second plant, and they would have their own allocations.
Okay, I'm just trying to identify if there's an issue with a plant closing and another plant within the same group picking up the activity from that plant that's closing, which may increase their emissions, whether that's been taken into account.
I mean, if my previous answer hasn't really addressed that, and maybe I can bring in Mariana, but I don't think that's an issue.
Yeah, so basically free allocations are calculated on the yearly basis. So if it is within the same operator that they close a sub-installation and then the activity is passed to another sub-installation, then that other sub-installation, if it increases emissions, there is a threshold to recalculate free allocations, depending on, so it's a 15% threshold. So if activity goes up beyond that, then free allocations are recalculated.
So the pre-allocation could be recalculated. That's helpful. Does any other members of the committee have any questions? Mark?
Thanks. Can I ask how these rules align or differ from the EU ETS? Or are there similar mechanisms around pre-allocations and rules within the EU ETS?
So we are keen that the UK government engages with the EU on their ETS scheme, so that we have so that we have a bit more consistency with the EU. But the UK already modified their ETS rules to be more in line with the EU. So effectively, we are sort of catching up with this. This has been I suppose you could have said it's been a loophole, where you could have had a situation where there was a closure of a plant that had free allocations, and the plant has ceased operations, and they still have those allocations, which have a value associated with them. So this is tightening up, very much in line with what the EU has done themselves. But obviously, I'm keen to see the new UK government engage more with the EU on what they're doing on ETS.
Okay.
Douglas, did you want to?
Yes, I did. Can I ask what impact assessment has been done on what this will mean for businesses in Scotland, and what may be the effect from this coming in? Well,
we're not. We haven't carried out a full impact assessment because there's not a regulatory provision for that to be done. The impact on businesses relating changes to permanent cessations has been published in an analytical annex alongside the initial response to free allocation review consultation in November 2024. So you'll be able to find some of the detail of that analysis there. But the main purpose of this is so that plants and operations which have an allocation, a free allocation, if they were to cease production, they wouldn't have this valuable free allocation for a plant that's no longer operational. So there has been actually quite a lot of criticism of the potential for that, meaning that those that are ceasing operations, that the operators will profit from this free allocation. And you'll see, there's been quite a lot of criticism of that loophole in wider society and indeed in the media.
But do you not feel we're making this too complex for businesses to understand? And if we look at comments from Jim Radcliffe yesterday, when obviously the ethanol plant in Grangemouth is closed, what he's saying is carbon trading regime. He wants a carbon trading regime that supports industry and decarbonisation equally. Are we not in danger of making this too complex that businesses close and we just offshore our emissions completely?
Well, the reason why the ETS is in place is to avoid carbon leakage. Is to avoid that offshoring as well. And obviously I saw Jim Radcliffe's comments yesterday on the UK's regulatory regime. There has to be things in place to encourage the decarbonisation of high-emitting sectors. I mean, that's surely what this committee scrutinises. That's certainly part of the drive of this portfolio in government, is to ensure that we don't have a situation where in 20 years' time we have the same level of industrial emissions. So the ETS has been set up to ensure that. Obviously, those that disagree with that have every right to disagree with that, but we are trying to get to net zero. We're trying to decarbonise our industry as much as possible, and we're trying to halt climate change.
But surely we shouldn't be getting to net zero by switching off our manufacturing industry, and I think that is the basis of Jim Radcliffe's comments in the article yesterday.
Well, I won't comment any more on Jim Radcliffe's comments. Obviously, he has his particular view. He's made that clear to the UK government. He's made that clear in the press. I mean, the ETS has been set up to ensure that these high-emitting sectors have free allocations. So there is an acknowledgement that they should have free allocations, because there's always going to be some sectors that find it harder to decarbonise than others. So this is to ensure, the ETS is actually to ensure that there's not carbon leakage. That's all I really have to say on that, because I think that if we didn't have systems like that in place, then we would offshore our emissions if there wasn't free allocation. This instrument is to ensure that companies aren't profiting from the ETS when they're not operating.
So you don't really have any concerns that our manufacturing industry is closing down because of the regulations that have been put in place by the UK and the Scottish governments?
No, because the free allocations mitigate against that. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about this particular instrument here today, which is designed to close a loophole in which operators who have ceased production would benefit from a scheme in which they had free allocations that weren't used by the operation.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, doesn't appear there's going to be any more questions. So move on to agenda item 3, which is a debate on the motion S6M 15731, calling on the committee to recommend approval of the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2025. Cabinet Secretary, I invite you to move the motion and speak to it if you feel you wish to.
Move the motion. I don't think I need to say any more than I did in my opening statement.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I now invite any contribution from members. There are no contributions from members over and above what we heard in the first part, so now I invite the Cabinet Secretary to, I'm not sure you want to sum up, respond to the debate. Thank you for acknowledging that. And we'll move straight on to the question, is that motion S6M 15731 in the name of Gillian Martin be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve the draft of the report for publication. Are you all happy with that? You are happy. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials. I'm now going to suspend the meeting briefly to allow a changeover of officials, and we'll reconvene at 9:35. Thank you. Welcome back. Our fourth item of business this morning is an evidence session on the 2025-26 Scottish Government budget. Today's evidence will focus on the net zero energy portfolio, and I welcome back to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero Energy, and her supporting officials. I've got Diarmaid O'Neill, the Interim Director of Environment and Forestry, and Catherine Williams, the Deputy Director for the Directorate of Energy and Climate Change from the Scottish Government. That's quite a difficult one to get your mouth around there. So before moving into questions, I'd like to invite the Acting Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you about the net zero and energy part of the Scottish draft Scottish budget. The budget for the portfolio is 900 million, and it's an increase of 221.1 million from 24-25. As always, it's an important part of a much longer and wider process. I appreciate the work that the committee is doing in its pre-budget scrutiny. It may be helpful to set this conversation in the context of the Scottish Government's overall approach to this year's budget. First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government has made clear it's a budget that focuses on delivering progress and laying the foundation for Scotland's long-term success. It's set against continued and unprecedented challenges to public finances. The budget focuses on resource across the four priorities set out in the programme for government, of which we're all familiar: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency and ensuring high quality and sustainable public services. And today is mainly about the third of those priorities, tackling the climate emergency. And through 2025-26, we intend to commit £4.9 billion of investment with a positive benefit for climate. That's across all government portfolios. But the £900 million net zero and energy budget's got a strong role in contributing to the other priorities too. We scale up renewable energy, restore Scotland's natural environment, and indeed tackle fuel poverty, which has an impact on the other government priorities. So I hope and strongly believe that these are objectives that we all share across Parliament. I'm looking forward to discussing the net zero and energy budget in detail.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. There's been a significant increase in the funds allocated to the offshore wind supply chain, I think from 10 million to 163 million. Can you just explain why that's needed, and can you clarify whether that will result in long-term jobs?
So we're at a very critical moment in time between various parts of the energy sector in terms of supply chain. So if you think of the supply chain at the moment, you think about their order books, they're probably mostly, the energy supply chain are mostly still servicing oil and gas. But as we know, we've got a steady decrease in the operations in oil and gas, but at the same time where renewables are, particularly offshore wind, is ramping up, offshore and onshore wind. But in terms of the offshore wind supply chain, we know as a result of the licensing round for ScotWind that we are going to have an enormous boost in activity as both the INTOG projects take shape and get their consents, and indeed the ScotWind licences take hold. We've got to make sure that the offshore wind supply chain, and I would actually say it's the energy supply chain, is able to ramp up its activities and prepare for the orders that they're going to have. And they're going to be able to do that in a way that perhaps pivots some of their activities to what's required for offshore wind. So that those order books, you probably will have a situation for quite a lot of supply chain companies where they will, they'll be servicing contracts between oil and gas and renewables for decades to come. But we are trying to make sure that they have the support in order to be able to pivot. Some of them might have to increase their capacity, because they will be serving oil and gas as well as opening up the opportunity of offshore wind. But as you rightly point out, Convener, we're tripling the capital funding to 150 million, and that's going to stimulate private investment as well. I'll give you an example of how that works. Obviously, we in terms of the supply chain, we did a lot of work with our overseas agencies as well to attract Sumitomo to build their HDVC cable in the Cromarty. And that's a result of some of the work that was done in making putting the right conditions, but also having the right sort of initial funding to attract a big company like that to Scotland. And we're very pleased that that's been able to be done. We've also got 500 million strategic investment to leverage additional private investment of 1.5 billion. Already we're seeing, as a result of the commitment from the government in the offshore wind supply chain, that is prompting private companies to come together to effectively pledge money for additional infrastructure. If you look at the work of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council and the strategic investment model, there is billions of pounds pledged as a result of the work that we've been doing, because they're seeing that the government is committing money as well. So that's not just a government investment in the supply chain, but it's also a prompting of additional investment coming from private resources as well.
You didn't mean to, but you dodged the question on long-term jobs and how we make sure they're long-term.
I can cover that. I mean, I think that's absolutely fundamental to what we're talking about. I talked about capacity of companies. So if you have got support for the offshore wind supply chain, that has actually got the maximum impact on Scottish jobs. Because, as we know, it is the supply chain that is probably, I mean, if you look at the oil and gas supply chain, that is where the most amount of economic value has come to Scotland over the decades of that. That is will also be the case for offshore wind, indeed onshore wind, and all the other renewable energies as well. That we effectively could be looking at, if we get this right, we could be looking at more people having jobs associated with renewables than indeed we ever had with oil and gas. So there could be an increase of people working in energy in Scotland as a result of this.
So to be able to do that, we've got to get into the manufacturing, surely, of it, as of the offshore turbines, as much as the manufacturing of offshore cabling, which is the latter you've mentioned already.
Well, supply chain is an awful lot more than just manufacturing. Manufacturing is a part of it. There's the innovation, and Scotland's always been traditionally very good at the innovation around the technologies, particularly working subsea. And we have got the innovation in terms of floating offshore wind, which will be an exportable skill. You know, once we have completed our ScotWind developments, you will see other countries looking to Scotland to see what we've done in floating offshore wind. And just as we did with oil and gas in the 1980s, you will find that there will be Scottish engineers and innovators going all over the world to help other countries with this technology. So it's not just the manufacturing, it's the skills, it's the innovation, it's the supply chain is an awful lot more than that. However, I do agree that there is absolutely a space for more manufacturing in Scotland. One of the things we did with the onshore wind sector deal is we pledged to have a blade remanufacturing plant in Scotland as well. So again, there's the manufacturing, but there's also the remanufacturing of materials as well happening in Scotland. So all important components.
Okay, before we delve into ScotWind, which I'm sure we're going to, or Monica's going to, Kevin's got a supplementary on that question.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to you all. I compliment Mr O'Neill on his taste in suits. Cabinet Secretary, you have talked there about that increase in capital, that opportunity to invest in the supply chain to make sure that it has a secure future. And you also talked about stimulating private investment by good use of that money. I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, if there is an opportunity for the government to maybe take a share in some of these companies who are innovating, a share so that we can reinvest profits in future innovation. As you are well aware, you and I have been at meetings where we've listened to organisations around about some of their innovative work. Sometimes they have a difficulty in getting capital. Can we invest and actually take a share so that we can reinvest in the future and have a continuous cycle of investment in jobs here in Scotland?
Yes, so it's obviously something we've been looking into, and officials have been looking around the sort of, I suppose, the regulations and the legal aspect of what the Scottish Government can and can't do in terms of taking a share of things, and that work is ongoing. Mr. Stewart, we've had some very interesting meetings with some innovators, and I was pleased to join yourself and Audrey Nicholl at one of those meetings in Aberdeen with a company that's looking to innovate in the type of technology, deep water technology. And you're right that sometimes there is a sort of a gap to become commercialisation. And this is where I see government being essential in helping companies get to the point where they're able to sort of get to commercialisation and things. And where they've got potential for massive growth, it would make absolute sense where there has been government support, whether it's through our enterprise agencies, whether it's been through the Scottish National Investment Bank, whatever it means, that there is an opportunity for the public, because it's not just it's the public to have a stake in those kind of developments and those companies as well. I am absolutely open to exploring this as far as we can to see if we can be in that space. As a result of meetings that I've had with yourself, but others, and indeed a general agreement with the tenet of your question, I have been having discussions with my officials about the art of the possible in this space, because, of course, what it is like when you're putting in public money, and I've explained the kind of public money that we're putting in to, I suppose, realise the potential of our supply chain, but also the innovators in this space. It would be a fantastic situation for the public to be benefiting from those companies as they increase their capacity and they grow, and indeed not just their operations that they have in Scotland and in Scotland, but in their operations, as I said in my previous answer, they export that technology all over the world.
You talked about the art of the possible there, and I know that some things are much more difficult to achieve than others. But in terms of that investment, is there a way, are you exploring ways to ensure that there are some kind of golden handcuffs so that the amount of jobs are maximised here in Scotland and are retained here in Scotland?
So there's a number of things. If I take Scotland, for example, you look at the licence conditions for the Scotland contracts. It develops that there is the companies and the consortia that have bid for those licences have to sign up to the conditions, and that would be local content in terms of the supply chain. So as a result of that, and again, that's the huge economic benefit that there will be to the whole of Scotland. And we're not just talking about the North East, and we're not just talking about the Highlands, we're talking about the whole of Scotland, because we are going to have companies that are growing and setting up as a result of, I suppose, realising the capacity is going to have to increase in terms of the supply chain. It won't be done by any one region, it will be done by the whole of Scotland. So by local content, we mean content of supply chain in Scotland. So those those who were putting these licence conditions together, I'll go over that Mr Matheson there, who's very instrumental in this, made sure, because one of the things about previously in oil and gas is obviously there wasn't the devolution settlement hadn't happened, you know, when most oil and gas was discovered. So they didn't have those kind of conditions. As a result of the Crown Estate being devolved, we've been able to work with the Crown Estate in making sure that the conditions around licensing the seabed for offshore wind comes with conditions, but also there will be conditions around some of the grants and loans associated with SNIB as well. There will be conditions associated with some of the support that they get from our enterprise agencies as well. And that's all to ensure, some of it is to ensure local content. But if we get these conditions right, that we will have a supply chain that's not just anchored in Scotland. You talked about golden handcuffs. I think it's quite light touch because it's obvious that the supply chain will be anchored in Scotland because that's where the skills already are. The skills, in fact, we are, potentially going to have a situation where we have orders in the oil and gas supply chain and orders coming for Scotland where they're going to have to vastly increase their capacity to be able to serve across the two industries as well. So handcuffs is maybe overstating it because it is a no-brainer that the supply chain will be in Scotland because we already have a very, very healthy energy supply chain in Scotland, which will have to increase its capacity in order to be able to serve both sides of the energy sector.
Thank you, Convener.
I fear it's going to be a long session if all the answers to every question are that length. I understand why you want to delve into it, but I'm going to bring in the person that you mentioned, the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson, for a supplementary on that before I go to Monica.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I want to just pick up on this issue about securing supply chain manufacturing, in particular here in Scotland. So if I take the example that you referred to, Cabinet Secretary Sumitomo, which I was the lead minister in pursuing Sumitomo investment. The key to securing Sumitomo's investment here wasn't just ScotWind and the pipeline that potentially creates, and also with the other offshore INTOG programmes, but it was the capacity to use programmes being taken forward here in Scotland at a pace that allowed them to make investment that once they were completed, they could export to other parts of Europe. So it was about pure manufacturing capacity being brought to the Cromarty Firth in Scotland. In saying that, if we deliver ScotWind, and I suspect there will be attrition in Scotland in terms of the overall level of finally produce, is that despite where we are in offshore wind at the present moment and the potential pipeline that we have, O&M in offshore wind is nowhere near the same levels of oil and gas. Therefore, manufacturing capacity is absolutely critical to delivering the just transition. But today we don't have, if you think about 4 key components in offshore wind, we don't have a blade manufacturer, a nacelle manufacturer, a tower manufacturer, or a foundations manufacturer, whether it be fixed or whether it be floating foundations manufacturing. And while in offshore wind floating we are world leaders in creating some of the ideas around floating offshore wind and demonstrating it can be done, is that if we innovate and invest in developing the ideas around it, but don't secure the manufacturing capacity, we lose a huge potential for helping to deliver a just transition. So I'd be keen to understand how not only your own directorate, but the enterprise agencies are working to nail down the scale of manufacturing capacity that will be critical if we are going to deliver a just transition. And key to that is going to be supply chain, but key to it is not just innovating the ideas, but it's creating the jobs here in Scotland. And manufacturing capacity will be critical to achieving that. How do you see that progressing? And what can you say to us in terms of the budget here that will ensure that we are on a pathway that will deliver that type of manufacturing capacity that will be critical for the supply chain?
So I would say that there are a couple of things we can point to, moving parts that are starting to come together in terms of creating the opportunity for the manufacturer. Obviously, I mentioned Sumitomo, but we've got RDC, we've got the Ventus in RDC here. That's 3,000 jobs. We have got, and if I can wind that out beyond offshore wind, we've got areas of Scotland of like former industrial areas where they're repurposing what's happening in those industrial areas to have the manufacturing capacity in industrial sites. I'm going to Hunterston tomorrow, for example, where there's a lot of activity in that space as well. But critical is the investment that there is, both not just from private investment, but the work that's been done by the enterprise agencies to scale up what's happening at our ports. So the investment in ports and harbours across Scotland, particularly in the north and the east coast, not just the north and east coast, because we've obviously got ports that are a great deal of investment in the northwest of Scotland as well. And you look at the work that's been done, for example, in the Energy Transition Zone in Aberdeen, sited around the same geographical area as the new port in Aberdeen as well. These clusters coming together, attracting inward investment, attracting private investment, but getting support from our agencies, providing sites for manufacturing. So you have these clusters of activity associated with the ports and harbours. Because obviously ports and harbours are going to be very important for the deployment of offshore wind, but they're also going to be key sites for manufacturing as well. So there is a great deal of emphasis been put on the ports and harbours infrastructure that's happening across the whole of Scotland. There is obviously, we have got the Green Free Ports announced as well. I think you might have even been Cabinet Secretary at that point where they were announced to prompt that investment into those areas as well. And of course, you'll have seen, I think, Green Industrial Strategy was launched last year, which sets out offshore wind as being a key area of investment and support from the government, but also our enterprise agencies as well. So creating that investable proposition, but the ports and harbours are going to be absolutely critical to that as well. Not only for the deployment of Scotland, but as you rightly say, for the deployment in that port's capacity to be, in fact, exporting the various materials that we could be manufacturing in Scotland to the rest of Europe as they look to take on the sort of technologies that we are developing in Scotland. But also there's the other added benefit, the long-term legacy benefit for those ports and harbours. You know, I look at, I'm just trying to think of, in particular, I was at Eyemouth, right? Eyemouth, traditional, fishing town, is now the launch pad for the crews going out to service offshore wind. And as a result of the investment in there, that relatively small harbour is doing lots of different things, but working with the fishing sector as well. So there's that long-term legacy benefit as well. I will stop there, Convener.
I want to drag you back to the 25-26 budget and where that money is involved in that. You've talked historically there about investment. I'm trying to just get a handle on this budget. Otherwise, if we go back on all the things that
that's why we're increasing the budget to 150 million. Because if I'm able to talk about what the monies have done up to now, the 150 million is a tripling of that activity. The tripling of that activity that's going to prompt the kind of things that Mr Matheson has said is an ambition.
I'm aware of the Eyemouth development there. I was fortunate enough to open the facility there when I was Cabinet Secretary. Can I take you to the issue of confidence in the sector in using this money to deliver the type of outcomes that you're trying to achieve? Because I'm keen to understand if funding like this over a 2-year period is, from where we are today, what does success look like in 2 years' time when you're back before the committee? And we're asking you, what exactly did that £150 million plus deliver, or in excess of that over 2 years? Key to this is confidence in the sector in the consenting of projects, so that there is a beat of projects that will attract manufacturing capacity delivery. Although this is budget funding which is specifically for capital and a small level of revenue funding, is any of it going to be used in order to make sure that we have sufficient capacity within the consenting elements of government in order to ensure that there's a timely, effective process in dealing with these projects? Because I'm sure you're well aware of the ongoing concerns about delays and the length of time it can take for projects to be delivered, which creates uncertainty in the sector.
So, to answer your question quite succinctly, without annoying the convener, because you know, when you're passionate about something, you can perhaps maybe wax lyrical and go on at length. So, forgive me, convener. In the consent space, we have already I think we more than doubled the capacity of the consent unit last year as a result of the issues that you have just put to me. We had a situation where when I first became Energy Minister, it was probably the main thing that the sector talked to me about, was the length of time it was taking to consent. So as a result of that feedback, we have doubled. Now, in a very difficult situation for the government, having to sort of look at their spending controls and look at that was the area in which we actually really went out and recruited more people, more than doubled. Not just that, we're going to have a graduate apprenticeship programme in the consenting unit as well, to hothouse graduates and come in and to learn how to work in that consenting. One of the things, though, that I have said to many people in the sector is, if you want fast consenting, your applications have to be good. We have made sure that we have more of a dialogue between the consenting unit and the developers to ensure that when applications come in, the right things are there's no delays in terms of the quality of the assessments. We've taken that feedback. It's already making a big difference. But I would add something else to. The consenting of projects and the time that it takes can be one potential barrier, which we are absolutely committed to addressing. We are addressing it. As I say, we've doubled capacity. The grid connection is now the thing that all the developers are speaking to me about. I'm hearing less concerns about the time for consenting. The grid connection is the major barrier. They don't have a date for a grid connection. That's a major barrier for investment.
Well, I suppose for many projects, they won't make a consenting application until they've got clarity on potential grid timelines, and the grid's what glues it all together. Just my final point on this is that in doubling the resource into the consenting side of government to help to deliver on this type of funding outcomes that you have in the budget, does doubling of that resource correlate directly to a shortening of the timeline in the consenting process? And if so, now that's already started, can you provide us with some details on exactly what we're getting for a doubling of the resources in the consenting unit in timelines for projects?
So the aim is to have consents from application delivered, yes or no, obviously, within 52 weeks. 52 weeks.
So, so the doubling started last year?
Yes.
Or you doubled the resources in the consenting unit?
Yeah.
Are we seeing a faster throughput happening already?
Yes, we are. And of course, I can write to the committee about what that increase in the capacity in the ECU, the consenting unit, has meant already, because obviously it's something that myself, as Cabinet Secretary, but also the First Minister, has taken a very keen interest in. We have actually instructed, but what more than that we've done is that we want to help, and that's not just for offshore wind, but in terms of the consenting for all projects, we want to help other parts of, like local government, for example, access the expertise that they need in order for, so if you talk about onshore wind or any kind of like infrastructure onshore, there was obviously the issues there about consent and the length of time it takes, about the capacity for some of our local authorities. That's why Ivan McKee and myself are working on a planning hub, a national planning hub, so that the specific expertise that is required, particularly in things like environmental impact assessments, etc., can be accessed, because that was also something that was slowing up progress.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that work from my previous role. But I'm just keen to make sure that there is in the world of civil service, that where there's an increase in resources, there's an increase in outcome in terms of timeline. And I think it'd be useful for the committee to see that information.
Yeah, I'm confident it's happening, but I can get the detail to the committee.
Be helpful, thank you.
Thank you. Just before we move on to the next question, I mean, I think that's 40 minutes on question one. That would predict that we would finish in about 7.5 hours' time. I'm sure, Cabinet Secretary, you won't want to be coming back next week to finish the session next week. So can I just encourage people, short questions, short answers, to allow everyone to get their questions in. Monica, you are next.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to bring you back to your opening remarks, where you highlighted the importance of achieving long-term success. So I want to ask about ScotWind in that context, because last year when the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government and Finance announced her intention to use up to £460 million of additional ScotWind revenue funds, that was widely criticised as a raid on a long-term fund for short-term cash. So I wondered if today you can tell us how much remains of the revenues originally delivered from the 2022 option agreements.
So I shared the concerns about using ScotWind revenue. ScotWind revenue should have a legacy benefit for Scotland. It should. We have reduced our initial assumed usage of ScotWind revenues, and that was mentioned by Ms Lennon, from 424 million to 160 million, and we're working to reduce this fully by the end of this financial year. We're now in a position to invest ScotWind revenues in a large range of projects for long-term benefits for Scotland, not least in this portfolio. To deliver our ambitions to tackle climate change, invest in growing the economy. We talked about that in terms of the offshore wind monies that I've just been discussing with your colleagues. Our capital package is supported by over £326 million of ScotWind funding. But there is also money going to other portfolios from ScotWind money. From ScotWind money. So obviously we've got the 500 million to anchor our supply chain, but we've responded to COSLA's ask for funding to respond to the climate emergency, making available £40 million to target local priorities, and on another legacy project, 20 million to the Orkney and Shetland councils for inter-island connectivity. So ScotWind money has not just been used in this portfolio, it's been used in other portfolios which have a legacy effect for long-term for Scotland, benefiting people. We have got 16 million for the purposes of progressing reform of agriculture, food and drink industries as well. So we are now able to release ScotWind money in a way that is going to reduce our emissions, but also really part of the just transition as well, but also part of Scotland's improvement in services and infrastructure as well. So I hope that that answers Ms Lennon's question.
Just to clarify on the figures, because that's been helpful. So the concern was that the fund was being raided to the tune of up to 460 million. I think government was looking at around 4 million. But you said 160 million, so, and that might go down further. So I just wonder if you can give a bit more detail around that timeline. And you said you expect it could be even less than 160 million pounds. What are you basing that on, Cabinet Secretary? What advice are you getting?
That on the Cabinet Secretary for Finance's projections. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance has said that we're working to fully reduce the 160 by the end of this financial year. So, ScotWind funding, I mean, this was a discussion that we had ahead of the budget, is that none of us wanted to use ScotWind funding for anything other than legacy infrastructure, improving the lives of people of Scotland, long-term projects, reducing our emissions and just transition, all the sort of things that I've mentioned there. So the assumed usage of 424 million has reduced to 160, and we're working to reduce this fully by the end of this financial year. The financial year, it says here? 25-26 financial year. Apologies.
That's in this budget timeframe.
Sorry, this 5-26. So this financial year. Sorry, I misread. So it is this financial year.
Thank you.
This
Monica.
financial year. So yeah, it's just really good to get clarity on that. So it sounds like there's been a bit of reflection within government. I think, Cabinet Secretary, you're stressing the importance of, the legacy project. So, are you confident going forward that there'll be every effort made to make sure that the use of the ScotWind funding and resources is clearly linked to specific climate, net zero, biodiversity funding? Is that the policy and intention going forward?
Did I hear Ms Lennon right? Did you say that there was friction within government? Sorry.
No, I think I used the word reflection. So
reflection, right? Sorry.
Reflection.
No, that's
sorry.
fine. So we never wanted to use this money. What we had is a situation last year where we were working on the assumption that we were going to have a lot less money to spend than we were looking at that scenario, which was a very real scenario. But we were also confronted with quite a lot of things that happened last year, particularly around public sector pay demands. So we did not want our local authority workers to go on strike. We wanted to negotiate with them, via COSLA on pay deals. There was teachers' pay deals to look at as well. There was an awful lot of demands on the public purse in terms of pay deals, and rightly, people are facing the cost of living as it is right now. You can absolutely understand why that's happened. So we wanted to work with all those sectors that were making asks of public sector pay and work with them. Now, we did not have the money really to do that, but we prepared ourselves for a budget, a settlement that would have meant that ScotWind money might have had to be used. Now we're in a situation, and every single member of the Cabinet wanted to be in a situation where ScotWind money was used for the sort of things that I've just talked about, and I'm pleased that we're now in that situation.
Okay, and final question, because I know there's not a lot of time left this morning. Are you able to tell us how much funding is anticipated to be received in terms of rental revenues, again, in ScotWind?
I don't have that figure in front of me. Obviously, that's a long-term projection. We can look into that. I can write to the committee about that. It's a matter of public record. I just don't have that in front of me. I wouldn't like to say the wrong figure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
I think that would be very helpful, Cabinet Secretary, because all of the leases will not necessarily all result in wind farms. So you must have a projected on-stream income in each year. I would suggest for 10 to 15 years, probably down the track, so you can work out where that money's going.
I can write to the committee with that, so you've got accurate information.
That would be very helpful. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I think the next questions come from Douglas Lumsden. Douglas.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I just wanted to ask something quickly on ScotWind, first of all. Obviously, you mentioned, Cabinet Secretary, that the one-off payments, which was about 700 million, that it almost seems to be getting used as a bit of an overdraft by Scottish Government just now, where if there's in-year pressures, then they'll dip into that and then put it back in later. And you also mentioned there's annual revenues that you don't know how much that's going to be yet, but do you know when they will start feeding into the Scottish budget?
So that's information that I'll need to get to the committee. Obviously, I was here to talk about the Scottish budget, so I don't have all the projections on revenues for Scotland for future years right in front of me. I don't want to give the wrong figures. I would say that ScotWind money is not an overdraft facility. The Scottish Government has to work within its limitations. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where, well, last year, where we thought our settlement was going to be quite difficult, given all the demands that we had. We are not able to borrow to deal with situations like pay deals. So any government, devolved government, would be in the same situation. Now, we could have refused those pay deals, but we did not want to do that because we did not want to have that impact on public service. So we're now in a situation where we've been able to balance the budget. I think it's a very good budget, and we're able to use those resources for the types of projects that I've mentioned in my answer to Monica Lennon.
And do you think there's a potential for using some of that ScotWind money to improve engagement with community groups that are going to be affected by not just ScotWind, but the improved infrastructure that may have to come on?
So we're working. We're actually, this is a major part of the engagement that I've been having with the new UK government. I have been. I've been very clear ever since I've been in post, since I was Energy Minister, is that I think community benefits should be mandatory. The previous government, the Conservative government, did not agree with me. I also believe that there should be mandatory community engagement. The previous government did not agree with me. And now I'm in a situation where I have a new government where I think my asks are having an impact. We've done a joint consultation on just that, and that took place last year. We're going to look at but what we're not waiting in the Scottish Government, we're not waiting for the outcome of that consultation. We're already working on revising our guidance for community engagement as part of the Scottish Government's own programme. Now, I would expect that developers would sign up to that on a voluntary basis. But what the UK government can do, and what I hope they will do, is that they have actually got the powers to make community engagement, with the guidance associated, and community benefit mandatory. Previous government were not interested in that.
Cabinet said community groups, they're frustrated. You haven't met any of those community groups from questions that I've submitted, and is there a reason why you won't meet the community groups that are concerned about the amount of infrastructure that's being built across much of Scotland?
Convener, I'm not sure what that's got to do with the budget, but I can say that there's been £5 million put in the budget for community action hubs to deal with this. I think that Mr Lumsden knows that I would be in danger of breaching the ministerial code if I engage with any groups where there are live applications or potential applications, a fact that I think he does know.
Okay, well, we will move on then to hydrogen now. There was a £100 million fund that was announced a few years ago. How much of that has been spent, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I'll tell you about the the allocations that there are in year and also in this budget for hydrogen funding. So you asked, just have a look, I don't know if I've got the figure of what's already been spent from that, but we launched 7 million in-year funding to grants to supply support to strategically important green hydrogen projects. The applications for that were submitted in December. They're now been looked at. I think there was 14 applications. Our delivery partner in that is Scottish Enterprise. So that builds on 7 million for the Hydrogen Innovation Scheme. That supported 31 projects. And obviously we're still involved in an analysis of what that's actually achieved and done. We also gave 6 million to the Just Transition, from the Just Transition Fund to Hydroglen, and that's like the green hydrogen farming pilot I'm sure the committee is aware of. And obviously there's the 15 million that's gone for the Green Hydrogen Hub in Aberdeen. But we're also, some of that money is I think around about £3.1 million for the Starega Speyside Green Hydrogen project, which I'm sure people have heard me talk about, which is a lot of that is working to decarbonise whisky distilling, but also to work with local authority in providing green hydrogen, potentially for fleets of vehicles in the way that the Aberdeen City Council has done in Aberdeen City.
So, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of the £100 million Emerging Energy Technologies Fund that was committed a few years ago, has that now been scrapped?
Absolutely not. No, it's 100 million, but we're not going to give 100. There's not going to be 100 million allocated in one financial year. It's going to be spread across a number of years in the same way that we're spreading our 500 million in terms of the supply chain a number of years. There's not £100 million worth of activity and projects yet to fund. We have to look at what funding is needed. That's why we've taken the approach of actually having a delivery partner of Scottish Enterprise, because they're speaking to the types of companies every day that require funding. So we are working with them so that that funding is focused and it's actually achieving value as well. So that's the approach that we take. We take that approach in working with the sector to fill in the gaps of getting things to commercial realisation, to fill in the gaps of realising innovation projects, as we did with the Hydrogen Innovation Scheme. And this is the approach that the sector is looking for from us, and that's what we're delivering on.
So there is still 90 million left in that Green Hydrogen Fund, is that correct?
Well, I think I've just totalled quite a lot of more than 10 million there. There's actually been a substantial amount of money already spent in hydrogen. But again, if the committee wants me to give a running total of the money invested in green hydrogen, I can do that.
I think it would be good just to get clarity on that fund that was announced a few years ago.
Yeah, but a 100 million fund was not for one financial year. It was over a period of years.
Period up until 2026, and I think the figures you gave was
we can
about 15 or 16 million. So it was over 10 million. I'll grant you that.
And in terms of sort of last year, the Cabinet Secretary stated that offshore wind support had been prioritised over hydrogen funding. Is that still the case?
There is an awful lot more demand for offshore wind support than there is for green hydrogen. There will be potentially more ramping up. Now, as one of the reasons that green hydrogen is going to be so important is because we are going to be generating far more green electricity. If you look at even now, we are generating more green electricity than we actually can get onto the grid. But even with grid infrastructure upgrades, which I know that Mr Lumsden has an issue with, even with the infrastructure upgrades to get green electricity onto the grid, we will still have a surplus of green energy. And that's why there will be so many opportunities for green hydrogen. So the innovation work's been done right now. The support for those companies that are scaling up are being done right now. But the priority is to get ScotWind developments, INTOG and ScotWind developments underway so that that feedstock of green electricity can be generated.
Cabinet Secretary, is it difficult to set an energy budget when you don't have an energy strategy?
No.
Why not? You know, if you look at the front page of the P&J today, SNP must ditch its stance on oil and gas future. So where are we going as a country when we don't have a strategy? So
the offshore wind, the hydrogen, there has been green industrial strategy is out there. The policy on all renewables is already widely known. I am at the moment working on the finessing the energy strategy in light of some of the developments that have happened in the UK space, particularly in the Supreme Court. It's very important that we are alive to some of the developments that have happened. The First Minister has made that point, even just in the last week. It's important that our energy strategy takes into account the work that we are doing, the work that the UK government is doing in the reserved space, so that we are dovetailing our energy strategy with that. But no, it is not difficult to put money into prioritising the areas of energy that we know need government support. And I think that budget does this very well.
So with a presumption against oil and gas, I presume there won't be any spend to help the oil and gas sector?
We've got Just Transition funding, the Just Transition Fund. So in terms of, as I mentioned in my previous answers, we don't just have a supply chain for oil and gas, and we don't have a supply chain for renewables. We've got an energy supply chain. Any funding that we put out there in terms of just transition helps oil and gas supply chain and oil and gas workers, because they are all energy workers.
In terms of, I'm going to move on to carbon capture and storage. Obviously, there was 80 million pledged in 2022. I don't think any of that money has been spent as yet, and there's nothing in this year's 25-26 budget to support that, is there?
So I think I've probably rehearsed this quite often. There is no request from the partners in the Scottish Cluster or the Acorn project for any of that 80 million until they get track status. They have said this to me. Yeah. The first meeting I had, I think when I became Energy Minister, within the first week, I had a round table with the Scottish Cluster partners, and they said to me, we will need that money at the point at which we get track status. Now, how many years are we waiting for this track status? That, if there's any silver bullet in carbon capture and storage for Scotland, it's track status. I've made this point to the Conservative government, along with many others. I've made this point to the current Labour government. We have got a massive opportunity. Now, that 80 million, the pledge that we made for 80 million, will be there and will be ready, and we will be directed by the Scottish Cluster and the Acorn project about how that is best spent in order to get that project off the ground.
So you would only see that money getting spent on the Scottish Cluster, not in terms of supply chain, getting ourselves ready for carbon capture, none of that. You would only see it being spent once it was track status. Is that your... I am... Even though there wasn't track status when this money was announced back in 2022.
We thought track status was imminent, and I think indeed the cluster thought it was imminent, and I think indeed the sector as a whole, and I think some of your colleagues were also expecting track status to be imminent, given some of their comments on the press as well. So we announced the 80 million because we were wanted to be ready to assist the Scottish Cluster when track status was given. Unfortunately, we're still waiting.
But you could be spending that money to get the cluster ready for when tracks...
The cluster are ready. The cluster are ready.
But supply chain, that could be getting spent on that just now to improve the supply chain.
Well, you can argue back and forth with me, Mr Lumsden. I'm telling you what the Scottish Cluster have told me, that they want that 80 million to be deployed at the point at which they need it.
So you don't think there's any need for any of that money to be spent now?
Mr Lumsden. Sorry, I interrupted you. You can finish that question.
Oh, you just asked the same question. I'm going to give the same answer.
OK. The Deputy Convener wants to come in.
Yeah, I think just off the back of that, I think I announced £80 million, and it was on the basis that we thought track status was about to be announced. So that was the intention behind it at the time. We've touched on hydrogen, we've touched on offshore. at wind, CCUS, and also a bit onshore. Can I ask you what provisions have been made in the budget to help to support wave and tidal power, an area where we are global leaders and have huge potential, but it is a sector that's extremely difficult to commercialise in order to make sure it starts to deliver at scale?
And we had a discussion on this last week with regards to GB Energy, because we had this discussion where we talked about wave and tidal needs that support, because to get to commerciality, technologies, proven technologies there. So the draft budget provides £2.3 million to Wave Energy Scotland in the final year of their 21-25 business plan. So that funding is going to support them to achieve their programme of objectives, to include the further testing of wave energy systems in real sea conditions, and that will support their journey to commercialisation.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Just before we go to Bob Doris, I'd say timings are improving. We're just predicting now 5 hours to complete all the questionings, not the 7.5. If we can keep them short, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Doris.
Convener, I will endeavour to be as concise as possible. I have to say the bar hasn't been set particularly high in relation to that. Can I ask about the Climate Change Committee? They're tasked by the Scottish Government to give timely advice and analysis in terms of the setting of 5-year carbon budgets and the carbon plans, and for the ongoing delivery and outcomes associated with that. What discussions have there been with the Climate Change Committee to make sure they're appropriately resourced and ready to deliver on all those important functions?
So they are appropriately resourced, and we had this discussion, I think, in the passage of the Climate Change Act around the resourcing, and they are satisfied the resource. We've actually got a little bit of an update on that. I'm just looking at my officials. I'm not quite sure if I have written that. I don't know if I've put it together, but I am going to write to the committee once we've done an analysis on what this means for the delivery of the climate change plan. But late last week, we had an indication that the Committee for Climate Change will publish their advice for us around the 21st of May. Did I tell you that already?
So we're
I thought that might have been breaking news.
Where that's going to take us.
Yeah. So we're still. So I'm glad that you've. So many letters go back and forth, but I'm glad that you got that information, and that will obviously have an impact on when the climate change plan. Now in statute is when we produce the climate change plan. But a very good first meeting, official meeting with Emma Pinchbeck, the new CEO of the Climate Change Committee in December, I think. I think it was might have been the week before we went on recess, around their approach to the advice they're going to give us and discussing our approach to our climate change plan as well. So I'm looking forward to getting that advice from them, and I'm under no illusions of just how much they are pulling out all the stops for us to get that advice to us in May.
Can I check about that, pulling out all the stops, because that comes back to, because the Budget Committee, of course, Cabinet Secretary to resource. Would you be able to say how much money the Climate Change Committee has had or is getting in the current financial year and what it's getting within the budget we're scrutinising currently? But I suppose the key question is, if they had additional funds, could they move quicker in the providing of that advice?
Yeah, I'm just checking my officials, but we don't have an allocation for funding the Climate Change Committee in our budget.
But we do. I assume the Scottish Government make sure they're appropriately resourced to provide advice.
Yeah, they've told us that they're appropriately resourced. So they were at the tail end of last year getting their advice to the UK Government, and as soon as they were finished with that particular tranche of advice, they were moving on to working on our advice. So I had that discussion with Emma Pinchbeck in December, but she already knew about it because obviously they would be very keenly watching the passage of the climate change bill through this committee and through Parliament. They heard our calls, they heard the committee's calls for timely advice, and now they're now in a position to say it's going to be round about the third week in May.
I'm sorry for asking the daft laddie question during budget scrutiny, but how are the Climate Change Committee resourced if it's not from a financial transfer from the Scottish Government or one of its agencies to the Climate Change Committee?
UK Government that funds the Climate Change Committee.
And we have no footprint in relation to the financing of that whatsoever?
I'll double check, but I'm pretty certain that we don't.
Okay, so let me ask the question another way then. Has the Climate Change Committee suggested to yourself at any point that there haven't been adequate resource to
No, they haven't.
Prompt advice? Okay.
No.
I suppose that's the substance
no, they
of
haven't.
what I need to know. I'm also conscious that when you were given evidence to the committee, for illustrative purposes only, I know Cabinet Secretary, but you suggested that the Climate Change Committee might publish advice on the 24th of March, and then you ran through a timescale of what that could look like in relation to parliamentary scrutiny for the advice, and then the draft climate change plan and the affirmative procedures beyond and all that. And we were looking at a date of November 2025, theoretically, in relation to that. But of course, the advice won't be the 24th of March. We now know it's going to be late May. Are you in a position to tell the committee what a revised timetable would look like in relation to all of that?
I'm going to have to write to the committee with that detail because we're doing that work now. I think we only found out on Thursday last week, so I'm going to write to the committee. Obviously, the committee know that indication has come, but I'm going to write to the committee once we've worked all of that out.
Bob, sorry, just to clarify, it would be very helpful. I think you wrote to the committee Cabinet Secretary on the 20th of September last year with the timescale. It would be helpful to have a amendment to the timings based on the timings that you gave us in the letter.
That's what we're working on.
That would be the most helpful place to be.
We'll do that as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Kavina, that's absolutely precisely what I was hoping to put on the record, given the committee's challenges in making sure that we have effective scrutiny.
Yeah, of course.
In relation to all of that, and the collegiate approach we've taken all of this in what was an expedited piece of legislation in the first place. Now this budget contains decisions we've heard already. I think you're with Douglas Lumsden that there's been an allocation from Scotland, for example, of 16 million in relation to agriculture, food and drink, 40 million for local priorities in relation to net zero. I think 20 million for Orkney and Shetland was mentioned. The reason I'm just putting that on the record because we've talked about any sector, we've spoken about ground source heat pumps or decarbonising the commercial sector or tourism or whatever. The point I'm making is that the committee did a recommendation that the government should seek advice from the Scottish Fiscal Commission regarding the costs and the benefits of various policies in the preparation of the next draft climate change plan. So the committee can decide whether we agree that government has prioritised appropriately in the right sequence for the maximum cost benefit for the outcomes we're wanting in relation to our targets. What discussions has there been with the Scottish Fiscal Commission in relation to that? I know that's a recommendation the Cabinet Secretary was considering.
So we're taking up that recommendation as a result of the discussion we had in committee, but we obviously want to work with the Scottish Fiscal Commission as much as possible because they provide that analysis on what we're doing. We're going to officials already been. I think I'm not quite sure if there's already been engagement. There has been engagement, but particularly as we put the climate change plan together. But since Mr Doris has also given me the opportunity to point to our budget line on energy efficiency and decarbonisation in the heat and buildings part of the portfolio of 349.1 million, in case you don't have that information. So we're continuing to invest over 300 million in heat and buildings programmes that is going to achieve the result of this is where one of our budget lines is very important in terms of the poverty, eradicating child poverty aspect of things, not just the decarbonisation, but also the reduction in fuel poverty as a result of that. Now, I think that's a very important consideration. And the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I'm very keen to hear what they think in terms of that, because I don't want to do anything that increases fuel poverty or exacerbates or makes worse child poverty in anything we do in this space. There has to be the twin goals of reduction in emissions, but also a reduction in poverty. And I think that's where that interaction with the discussion with the Scottish Fiscal Commission is going to be absolutely critical.
I'm glad you put that on the record, because Just Transition quite rightly would talk about jobs in the north east of Scotland and everything else, but it's making sure those who are most vulnerable in society aren't inadvertently victims of the pursuit for net zero. So I'm pleased you put that on the record. Can I just check, and just finish my line of questioning, Convener, will the Scottish Fiscal Commission have to upscale in its expertise and the amount of officials that they have? Because depending on the level of detail that they provide the Scottish Government, there will be quite a significant increase in costs and need for additional expertise. So the committee had hoped, for example, when the draft climate change plan is published, the Fiscal Commission will already have given some detailed advice which has informed the choices that the Scottish Government has made. And we'd want to make sure that that's appropriately resourced.
The Scottish Fiscal Commission has not made representation of that nature, that they have to increase their capacity at all. And obviously, that's a question you might want to put to them. But it is essential, and I think that's the argument was made very well during the passage of the Climate Change Act, that the costs and benefits of policies and proposals have to align with the budget. And I pointed to some of the work that we were doing within government to look at the impact of climate change related policies in two ways. So on the one hand, we need to make sure that what we're doing across government, as much as possible, has got a carbon associated with it and emissions reduction associated with where it's possible. And that was part of the pilot that I was talking about, which has been a lot of the work has been used in this budget. But also the other side of things is that the policies that we put forward in terms of, or the legislation or the regulations that we put forward in terms of anything putting emission reductions into action, does not have an unintended and an unjust transition consequence for particularly vulnerable groups. But not just vulnerable groups. The people of Scotland should not become more fuel poor as a result of something that we... I mean, that just is an absolute... if there's a message and a stick of rock going through me, it's eradicate fuel poverty. So I don't want to do anything that is going to have the sort of unintended consequence of the nature that Mr Doris has put.
So just for clarity, it's not a question for an extended answer, it's really just a confirmation, I suppose, that it's the Scottish Government's intention, the Scottish Fiscal Commission will be fully resourced as appropriate, so that when the draft climate change plan is published, it will already have given relevant and appropriate advice to the Scottish Government by that point.
Yeah, I believe so. And of course, it's a statutory consideration of the Climate Change Act in 2009 that everything we're doing is costed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we're sort of at a logical place just to take a 5-minute break before we move on to the next set of questions. So if I could ask members to be back here at 10:45, so we could go. It's slightly less Cabinet Secretary than 5 minutes, but there's a bit of leeway there. So I suspend the meeting. Okay, we'll move back into open session now with the committee, and we're now with the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. You've got some questions, Michael.
Thanks, Convener. In your response to the committee's draft budget scrutiny letter, you mentioned that you were undertaking a cross-portfolio net zero finance project in order to look at climate change project financial risk. Can you maybe give us an update on how that work's been taken forward and what's involved with it?
So would that be the Global Climate Emergency Programme Boards? I'm just double checking which particular. So that's the net zero assessment. The net zero assessment. So I'm
net zero finance.
There's a couple of things. There's the net zero assessment of the budget, or the financial risk.
So it was a cross-portfolio net zero financial risk project.
Yeah. So the government group ensures that, it's to ensure that portfolios are aligned and contributing to climate change programmes, and that supports that kind of cross collaboration between portfolios, resolution of issues across portfolios, because sometimes it can be competing, and I mentioned one of them before the break around, the unintended consequences of maybe some things on poverty, and this sort of reporting process gathers information on both the progress, but the finance, resource and risk across portfolios as well, and then it's used to inform decision making. So, we recently identified a need to focus on addressing the climate change programme financial risk, and the outcome of this work is that we're using financial resources available to ensure that we achieve our climate change outcomes and net zero target, but not taking financial risk or putting others at financial risk as well. So there's a variety of cross-government initiatives in place to support that. There's that provide the transparency on the emissions impact of government activity and spend, carbon assessment of city-region deals, for example, of growth deals, strategic environmental assessments and taxonomy, and high-level carbon assessments of the budget. So there's a number of streams of work even within that sort of headline there. The net zero assessment provides that insight into the emissions impact of policies and interventions, and obviously the impact of policy interventions across portfolios. And if you look, I think you've got Miss Hislop in next week, so obviously there's quite a lot of the actions in her portfolio which are based on reducing emissions, but also Mary Goujon's rural affairs portfolio as well, in terms of forestry, peatland restoration, anything to do with land management have an impact as well. So this programme, and it's kind of governed by the GC Programme Board, look at that and underpinned by a lot of these streams of work, which help us to sort of make the assessment of policy having financial risk associated with it, but also budget having emissions associated with it as well. So they're all dovetailing into one another.
So has the project, has it been completed, and has it identified financial risk in particular policy areas? So
it's an ongoing process, and it's probably I don't know how complete it will ever be. It will always be an iterative process that will happen, because obviously new policies arrive, new risks could be apparent as a result of policy interventions. So it's an ongoing process, but the methodology underpinning it is established.
And has there any financial risk been identified across these portfolios?
That's something that I would probably have to write to the committee to give in more detail. There's a couple of things in my mind that do, but I am going to wait and give the committee the detail on that rather than speculate.
Okay, that'd be helpful. Thank you. You mentioned earlier on the £5 million that's been allocated to the climate change hubs.
Yes.
Which is for, I understand, if I can just clarify what that funding's for, is that funding specifically for climate change hubs as their core funding, or is it money which has been given to climate change hubs to undertake both deliberative and also participative engagement processes? And if so, how is that funding going to be broken down?
So we've got a number of things. I'll talk about what the hubs have already done with the funding that had to date, give you an idea of the sort of thing they're doing. They've got events and workshops reaching people and supporting community groups to take action. They've provided small grants to community projects. They bring in new groups into the climate conversation and support groups to apply for wider funding as well. So that core funding obviously helps the establishment of the climate hubs and the operations of the climate hubs, but they also support knock-on community groups. You know, it could be people who've set up a group within a small community to do more and to apply for funding in other areas that might be available. I hope that answers your question. I can maybe give you a little bit more detail if you want. I mean, the hub's primary focus is obviously climate action, and that encompasses areas like energy, transport and waste, but it's also really community-based as well, and enabling and empowering people to make decisions in their communities about the right actions to take. And I think that advice capacity is really important, because that advice capacity can also lead to community groups accessing funding. So if we look at the Just Transition funding that had a community aspect, there was a participatory budgeting aspect of it in the first tranche of the Just Transition funds, which I know you'll know really well. You can imagine that a climate action hub would be able to point a community in the direction of applying for that or applying for another tranche of funding as well. So we've now got 24 climate action hubs across the whole of Scotland, which means we've got national coverage. But there's the knock-on effect what they'll have on smaller climate groups and smaller community groups, I think, will be pretty significant.
So that's very helpful. Can I just clarify, so is the £5 million for the core funding for the 24 climate change hubs?
Yes.
Okay. And is in some of this funding is for both deliberative and also for participative engagement programmes? Is that correct?
Yes.
Or is this just a core funding to...
No, I thought it's a core funding.
It's additional funding for...
It's additional funding. Sorry, can I just check? The £5 million is the core funding for the climate action hubs? Yes.
Okay. And how much funding do the climate change hubs get over and above their core funding to deliver deliberative and engagement programmes, and participative engagement programmes?
Right, in terms of so I'm just having a look at some of the other potential budget lines that there might be around participation, but I might have to write to the committee with that, because it's maybe a level of detail that I don't have immediately in front of me right now. Can I write to the committee with that detail? Because obviously there's quite a lot of climate action funding in different tranches and different budget lines that obviously can be applied for
that'd be
by
very
whoever.
Yeah.
And I'm maybe not doing it justice by not having that detail in front of me, so I'll write to the committee when I follow up.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much. Mark, I think you've got some questions now.
Yeah, I've got quite a few questions, but I'm going to keep them short and sweet.
Well,
so
you've been very quiet so far,
if we
so
can,
I'm sure
indeed,
you'll get a fair crack.
So far. Can I go back to the money for heat decarbonisation in particular, which you mentioned earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, and I think you described what I think is there in the level 4 budget figure, which is quite a big sum. I think it's around 360 million, but it's not really clear what the scope of the programmes will be that sit underneath that. So I'm not really clear to what extent that 360 million meets the government's existing commitment for heat decarbonisation that it made several years ago.
So
I'm not really clear also about whether underneath that budget line there's money in there to do supply chain development working with the industry. So what I'm looking for either now or after this session is a lot more detail as to what lies under that pretty chunky sum of money and whether we're on track to making homes warmer and cheaper to heat, and whether we're realising those amazing opportunities for people coming into this industry.
So there's a number of programmes associated with the heat and buildings spend, and I'll mention some of them. Obviously, we've got Home Energy Scotland Grant and Loan Scheme. That's open for applications. We've been able to keep that open. It has been hugely subscribed. But I wanted to make sure that a vehicle like that is working very well was able to adapt to the demand that was out there. We have got key infrastructure and building for decarbonisation through the Heat Network Fund. And again, that leverages private investment to deliver that ambitious programme as well. We have got, I'm just having a look at some of the other things that are under that. We've got to support 20,000 households to save up to £500 on their energy bills, making homes warmer through a range of schemes there. So we've got Warmer Homes Scotland, the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Fund, the local authority area-based schemes, which again are very, very successful. And indeed, probably demand is outstripping supply at the moment. Home Energy Scotland Grant and Loan, the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Grant and Loan, Scotland's Heat Network Fund, and the Green Public Sector Estate Decarbonisation Scheme as well. That's in the heat and buildings, but we've also got money going to community energy as well. Now, I know that's not heat directly related, but money for CARES allowing communities to access the advice and support when they're putting community energy. And I think I mentioned last week that we are hoping to get an allocation of some money from GB Energy, from their local power. And it's not obviously in our budget, but using that vehicle, which, you know, tangentially has an impact, as well as all of these delivery schemes that we're continuing to fund. So it'd be really good if we could get a breakdown of that 360. I mean, if not now, then at another time, so we can see exactly what is on track. And then, you know, related to this is also the Heat and Buildings Bill, which, if it becomes an act, will be an absolute game changer in terms of developing demand, developing supply chain, setting a clear indication about when heat regulations will change. Is that coming? Yeah, so there is already a great deal of demand. As I said, a lot of these schemes are actually, you know, struggling to actually meet the demand that is out there already. The individual allocations to these particular schemes are still to be decided. Now, obviously, I put forward my budget asks based on the operation of them to date, but also based on an increasing demand for all these schemes as well. So I might not be able to provide you that level of detail until ministers have agreed on that, but when we do, I will get the committee to that.
Okay,
but
so
I'm committed
the working
to have
assumption
all these...
then is that, sorry to interrupt, but I'm just trying to get clarity. So the working assumption then is that the budget will be the same as last year, is that right, for these individual programmes that you've just spoken about? Unless there's a decision coming post-budget to change the allocation of different schemes.
I mean, I'm looking down here. There's an uplift of 10% according to this, but I'll maybe check that and come back to you.
Yeah. Broadly, we'll look at the allocations within schemes. If you're right. So broadly, yes, for example, Warmer Homes Scotland, we increased the budget during the year to 80 million. So it will be some trade-offs within the schemes. So broadly, we'll start with the existing budget and then look at where things have changed as to exactly how we allocate within.
So one of the things that I'm able to do throughout the year, as Catherine has kind of said, is where there is particular demand for one scheme, but there's money in another scheme that has already kind of met their demand, I'm able to pivot money. I think it's really important because where there's a scheme that's got, you know, a lot of people wanting to maybe install whatever it might be, or to take energy efficiency measures and have grants associated with that, but where we've got another scheme that doesn't have that level of demand, that we're able to be flexible around that, because what we want is action, and what we want is support getting to people when they want it.
Okay. You're not able to set that out at this point? You're not able to say where you think there may be more or less demand for those individual programmes at this point in the year?
I can certainly write to the committee with an assessment of where I think the demand is happening,
Okay.
because I've seen it over the year, and I've had to make decisions about putting more money here and there.
Okay.
I mean, I think one example is, and I'm pointed to area-based schemes in particular being very successful, particularly, you know, you'll see a picture in some local authorities doing much more than others, but they particularly seem to be doing very well.
Okay, and just to go back to my original question, is there money in there, resource in there for supply chain development?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, spread across some of these schemes that I've outlined to you.
Okay. And then another point that's been raised with us by Existing Homes Alliance is the capacity of the Heat Network Support Unit. Now, we've already talked about government capacity, which has been a theme, hasn't it, in terms of our analysis of government's action on climate change. There is a call for that unit to have more resources, so that we can start really rolling out heat networks at pace. We're all aware of the potential there, but it clearly needs an agency to make it happen, and to really build on some of the work that's been done around local authority, local heat strategies, heat strategies.
These are all things we're looking at.
Is there money there? Is there new money there for?
So we're also working with local authorities and COSLA on this in particular, because obviously quite a lot of that is coming at a very local level. But we've obviously got the Heat Network Fund. But I'm happy to have those conversations about any more capacity that's required in that. Of course, one of the things that the Scottish Government money can do is leverage private investment, and you've seen that already. And I've had quite a lot of conversations, particularly with leaders of council, where they're saying that they can leverage private investment in heat networks, having that initial support from government, and that is. We had a very, I won't give detail on who I spoke to and the detail of the conversation, but there's an awful lot of private investment out there that can be leveraged as a result of what we're doing in the Heat Network Fund.
So if there's any more detail on that, that would be useful as well. I'm going to skip to another set of questions now, and it is about the climate change assessment of the budget and the different strands within that. So there has been a pilot, net zero assessment pilot within government, and I gather as an independent review as well. Will those be available? When are they available for us to look at that work?
Okay, this is why I got a little bit confused when Michael Masson was asking me about the other work. So that was the agreement on the joint budget review. We're trying to improve the information around the government spend in terms of climate impact, yeah? So we obviously are committing that 4.9 billion in terms of resource spend across government for activities. And we've got a supporting document that sets out how the budget will impact on our climate change priority. And that document is divided, and this is a result of the work we've been doing in the pilot. So the supporting document is divided into two parts. The first part presents, it's got an overarching climate narrative, and then they've got highlighting the key spending areas from multiple portfolios across the budget that contribute towards emissions reduction or their response to climate change. And then the second part has got a carbon assessment commentary of the capital and resource budget. So that sort of net zero assessment is to, you know, embed that kind of carbon assessment in the early stages of the budget deliberations and the policy development, and then the spending decision making as well. So I've got here a little the rollout of this. Internal guidance was sent to all Scottish Government officials, preparing budget advice for ministers. That was developed in October. So every portfolio got that advice. And then there was a requirement policy proposals result in a material change in greenhouse gas emissions, and that net zero assessment should have been conducted, and the outputs of that would be in the advice to ministers as well. I mean, if you look at, I mean, I can give you an example from the rural affairs portfolio. You know, Mary Gushon can talk to her budget lines, but like 53 million for forestry grant scheme would have a carbon budget associated with it. The peatland restoration budget, I think it's about 35 million, has got a carbon assessment associated with that as well. And obviously there'll be areas in which, even within the health budget, in terms of the sort of like capital part of that budget, in terms of like, you know, builds and schemes for the estate, would have a carbon assessment associated with that as well. I don't see that work has really been finished. I think it's been vastly improved as a result of the net zero assessment pilot, but this will be the first budget that's actually had that pilot integrated into the early workings and deliberation associated with the budget.
So I think the question then on the back of that is around transparency, because clearly, as you're saying, there has been an assessment about whether a particular policy will result in a material change in terms of carbon emissions. But presumably that could include absolutely every policy. So I'm interested in where you draw the line on that. If there has been an initial assessment of whether policies will result in a material change or not, can that be made available? Is that publicly available?
So the document I've talked about...
So that it's clear then to say, well, look, OK, that there was an assessment across these areas of transport policy or energy policy or whatever. These were determined as having a material change, but these weren't. And I think showing those workings are really, really important for this whole process.
This is the first kind of iteration of it. So I talked about some of the parts of that work that have made it into this year's budget. It's by no means finished. You know, next year there will be a ramping up of this. And obviously, as a result of the climate change plan deliberations, we'll have a lot of more information in terms of the emissions reduction aspects. And I'll be having to work very closely with my cabinet colleagues, because obviously a lot of the action in the climate change plan is going to be taking place across a number of portfolios. So I don't see that the pilot happened. In time for this year, we got the actions that I set out. We've got the document, which I believe the committee has a copy. We should have a copy of. But I don't see this as an end result. I think we need to maybe have that more granular detail of the type that you suggest.
Yeah. So this has been a really good example of Parliament working constructively over several sessions with government. Can I go back to my original question then? Will the assessment pilot and the independent expert review be published? And then will we get transparency about the individual decisions about whether particular policies will result in material change? How much publishing of this will government
Can I take that away and have a discussion with my team about the transparency element of it and what is going to be published and when, so that you've got the information. But for now, with regards to this budget, there is that document which has the two parts in it, which give it that climate narrative, and then the contribution towards our response to climate change, and that carbon assessment commentary of the capital and resource budget.
So I think we had those. I think we had those last year, and they added something, but it still makes it very, very hard to make an assessment about how climate change has influenced individual policies. And I think that's the difficulty, has always been the difficulty of scrutinising budgets. So the overall narrative, great. The taxonomy, I suppose, is still questionable, because although it says 4.9 billion is being spent loosely on climate change things, when you actually look at the list, there are some things in there which don't really add up to climate action. They're climate neutral, They're creating perhaps a supportive environment for climate action, but it's not exactly climate action. So I would question whether those two things that are already being produced and were produced last year actually helps this committee and this Parliament really get a grip on where spending is going.
And your feedback would be helpful in that, because I think that obviously we are wanting to go further. Mm-hmm. But what we've produced now, feedback from the committee on the detail that's in there, would be really helpful for us as we develop this further. I hope that Mark Ruskell would agree with me that it's better than it was 5 years ago, when there really wasn't. I mean, we are working very hard to give that level of detail associated with the budget spend, and it's that the pilot is an indication of that, and the work that's been done this year is an indication of that. But we're not there yet.
I think we would welcome feedback on the
taxonomy. Yeah. Dermot is just confirming that he would like feedback on.
Okay.
On the taxonomy.
I realise that this is an innovative policy space, and that in some ways this Parliament is taking a lead on it. But I'm also aware that time is running out. Last year was the hottest year on record globally. So, we need to make decisions now that don't lock in emissions. Yeah. And to wait another year for more transparency, I think, is perhaps not meeting the nature of the emergency. But I recognise the work that's been done on all sides, including by, Clark's committee and Spice and others. I think that's it for me just now, Convener. I'll come back in on a question later on.
Well, I think you will be, yeah. Monica, I think you've got a question now that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I want to ask about the Just Transition Fund. Is the Scottish Government still committed to releasing the £500 million in the Just Transition Fund over its 10-year lifespan? And if so, how is that going?
So last year I asked for an assessment of the first tranche of the Just Transition Fund, and we're still doing that work because I want the Just Transition Fund to be adding value and to be having a very clear effect. So I asked my officials to undertake an assessment on how the Just Transition funding that has been allocated to date has worked, what that's meant in terms of increased capacity of potential of those who maybe received that funding, what that means in terms of outcomes. And I want to continue to build on that Just Transition Fund for North East and Moray. We already allocated 75 million. We are reopening the Just Transition Fund this year. And I'm actually right in the middle of work with my officials as to what that new allocation will look like in terms of the offer, and maybe it might have a focus, it might have a number of different focuses, but I want it to be very outcomes based. So 15.9 million allocation in this year's budget for the Just Transition Fund. If I can maybe just go through some of the other things with like the funding for climate action hubs, the support to the Just Transition Commission, the Climate Change Committee, and this is where I have to apologise to Mr Doris, because we are just actually trying to find, we do give funding to the climate change, and he's absolutely right. I didn't have it in front of me, and I should have said, we're actually trying to get the figure for you, so I apologise to Mr Dawes. Climate Change Committee, Emissions Trading Scheme Authority, Climate Justice Fund and the Scottish Climate Intelligence Service, and funding for Scottish Climate Week. But the actual Just Transition funding for this year's allocation will be 15.9 million. And what that is going to look like in terms of the funding round that we put out, I am working on, based on the analysis of what happened with the allocation of the 75 million. And, assessment of who got it, what outcomes were achieved, what capacity it built, etc., etc.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just try to take a note of those figures. So, year one was 2022-23. We know about the £75 million so far because that was confirmed at the end of 2024. You've mentioned another 15.9 million. So that adds up to 90.9 million. And you mentioned a few other projects. So far out of the 500 million, is 90.9 million the total that's been allocated, or is there more than that?
If your sums are correct, yeah, I mean, the numbers that I've given you in front of me would be 75 million spent already, and this year's allocation 15.9 million allocation.
Okay, so it's a £500 million fund over a decade.
Over 10 years, yes.
Over 10 years, that's right. Are you confident, Cabinet Secretary, that there are appropriate projects to invest in? Because there is a concern that the first few years it's been a little bit slower than many people would like. Do you see a bit of catch up in terms of more money going out the door?
I wouldn't agree with it being slow. I would actually say we're oversubscribed for the amount of projects that wanted Just Transition funding. Obviously, being a North Easter myself, I've actually had the pleasure of visiting quite a lot of these projects, and indeed the people that have been successful in getting the Just Transition funding. There's other work that's been done as well. I mean, there's been investment in the Green Hydrogen Hub. There's been investment in Net Zero Technology Centre. There's been other things that don't come from the Just Transition Fund directly, but have had a Just Transition effect as well. But in terms of the Just Transition Fund, there was like projects, and then there was the participatory budgeting section of it, which actually went out to third sector partner organisations, which invited applications for, like, small community groups, for example. At the moment, what I'm doing and my officials are doing is we're trying to assess the outcomes based on the 75 million, so that, and I suppose this directly relates to the sort of basis of your question, Monica, that we make sure that the money that's going out in the Just Transition Fund has positive outcomes associated with it, and is really targeting the right areas where we need intervention in terms of a just transition. So we're doing that work. We have been doing that work for over the last year, to be honest, and it will inform the next allocation round and the detail of that.
Thank you. So good to hear the commitment is still the same, around the 500 million over the decade. You said that the fund is oversubscribed. So has there been any discussion about increasing the amount of the fund over the 10-year period? Is that something you think might be
all funds
necessary?
are oversubscribed. There's certain projects that don't just have the right criteria that others do. So you have to make a judgment. You can't just be giving out funding, public money, without that assessment. So a great deal of interest in the fund. Obviously, I'm delighted to say that we're reopening the fund this year. And we are looking at the criteria for the fund. We're looking at, potentially where we want to target the fund. Maybe, obviously, next year's allocation may be different based on what happens this year. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the 500 million Just Transition Fund is an extremely important tool for the North East and Moray, and shows our commitment to particularly an energy transition that's happening principally in these areas.
Just a final question, because I understand the approach around targeting, and you're keeping things under review. There was some mention earlier on about Grangemouth, and again we talked about this last week, Cabinet Secretary. In terms of the Just Transition Fund, is there any of that resource likely to come to the Grangemouth complex?
So there's other funding that has gone to the Grangemouth complex. So obviously the funding for skills gone to Forth Valley College. None of that's come from the Just Transition Fund. It's got a separate line completely. Their funding for Project Willow, half funded by Scottish Government, half funded by the UK Government as well. So we're not taking money from the Just Transition Fund for the support that we're giving to the Grangemouth cluster and wider community. City. That is a separate fund, and obviously there was the Falkirk Grangemouth growth deal as well, which has not come from the Just Transition Fund. That's got a separate budget line. I think it's actually from that's 7.75 million. I'm struggling, sorry, Catherine, to read your numbers there. And I think that comes from the economy.
Within the energy transition.
The energy transition. So that money's not come away. It's not been taken from the Just Transition Fund, which is why we're able to have that as a separate fund focused on the North East and Moray.
I did say final question, but maybe just squeeze in a final question on that. So you mentioned, Cabinet Secretary, you've got criteria. You need to make sure that we've got good projects, it meets all the conditionality that government wants to apply to contracts and bids. If if there was a demonstrable need at the Grangemouth complex for more funding, and you've got money sitting in the Just Transition Fund, could there be flexibility within government to look again at the criteria to release that money if that was going to be helpful?
So we've been able to find money for Grangemouth out with the Just Transition Fund, but of course the Just Transition is not just in North East and Moray. So there was other allocations of money, but there is also decisions that can be made in year as things develop. Obviously, we've got Project Willow, which will be due to report. I'm actually getting a briefing on that this week from Ernst & Young as to what's actually the detail that's in Project Willow. So there will be work potentially across government and indeed the enterprise agencies to respond to what's in Project Willow. And it's a cross-government situation. The Scottish Government and UK Government working together, so there's also the potential tranches of funding that could come from the UK Government. But the Just Transition Fund, as it stands, is for North East and Moray.
Thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you, Monica. And that really was your final question on that one. Kevin and Douglas each get one question as a follow-up on that. I'm sorry, we are short of time.
Thank you, Convener. In terms of the Just Transition Fund, one of the important but lesser looked at aspects of the fund is the Just Transition Participatory Budgeting Fund. And awards were made just the other day again with £333,333 allocated for projects in Aberdeen. You've said that this funding will be analysed to see if it is making a real difference. When can we expect that analysis, particularly around about the PB funding, to see the difference that has actually made? And can I also ask, in terms of the Just Transition Fund as a whole, there have been attempts before to get the UK Government to match the Scottish Government funding. Where are we at with that? Is there any positivity there at all?
So on the last point, there's not been a decision by the UK Government to match that funding. So, let's put it on the record now. It would be great if they did. What a difference we could make there if we doubled that funding. And, it's on the record now. It's been on the record many times by yourself and others who would like to see that. The analysis, we're working towards March for that. I think it's really important that when you've got a fund like this that's had so many different parts to it, and you're right to point to the participatory budgeting side. I think in Aberdeenshire it was Aberdeenshire Voluntary Action, and it was with TSI in Moray, and then there was the Aberdeen City TSI as well. ACFO. Thank you very much. And so we're working with them to get that analysis, but also with some of the people that actually You know, I've done quite a lot of visits, actually, and talking to people who've had the budgeting. There was a great one in a disused bowling green in the city centre, which I'd highly recommend that you go to, who had, you know, they basically had effectively a climate cafe and fruit and vegetables available. So these are things that have had not just an impact in climate, but they've also had a real community impact as well. And I want to take that into account too.
Bonnie Muir.
Bonnie Muir, thank you.
Right,
Thank you.
sorry. I think we're getting on to anecdotal fruit markets there. But Douglas, if you'd like to ask your question, not too wrapped up in...
I will be brief, Camilla. Just following on from Monica Lennon's questioning, obviously for the first 4 years of the Just Transition Fund, we'll be up to about 90 million, which leaves about 410 million for the remaining 6 years of the fund, which would mean the annual amount would go from 15.9 million up to somewhere like 68 million per year for the remaining 6 years after 25-26. Do you really think that's feasible when we don't actually have a Just Transition Plan?
We do have a Just Transition Plan. It's in draft at the moment. I will be rolling out the Just Transition Plan. We've also got the Just Transition Plans associated, you know, with a number. We've got the Grangemouth Just Transition Plan as well underway. There's a lot of work being done in that area. Just Transition, I hope that I have proved, and myself and Dr Allen, and indeed Ms McCallan, have proved that we have got many Just Transition policies that will be in that plan that are already happening. So I'm confident. I think it's a really important area. It's actually a critical area of work for the government to be involved in. But I echo Mr Stewart's calls for the UK government to double that funding. We can do so much more.
But do you think it's feasible to go from last year 12 million, this year 15 million?
Of course it's feasible.
I'm waiting for an answer.
Of course it's feasible.
Still haven't
Well,
answer.
with
Here's
respect,
my answer,
sorry,
yes.
I am really pushed for time, and there are other people to get in, and I don't want to cut myself out. So I have questions to ask as well. So with respect, I gave you each one question. The Cabinet Secretary chose not to answer it. I'm sorry.
No, I have answered it. I think it is feasible.
To your satisfaction, Mr Lumsden, I would say. Mark, you have a question.
Yeah, I mean, just following up on that, I mean, the focus on the North East is understandable given the concentration of oil and gas jobs there, but I'm just wondering if you recognise that, you know, the footprint of that oil and gas sector goes well beyond the North East. You'll be aware of the conversations that I've been leading with unions, Fife College, Fife Council and others in the local community around a just transition for Mossmorran and the need for early planning around that and the opportunities that might come for jobs. So I'm just wondering where that kind of sits as well, because with Grangemouth, there are some dedicated funds around Project Willow. Just Transition Fund is very much focused on the North East, but there are also other opportunities for workers to diversify into new sectors and for there to be ongoing training and other things which for relatively small amounts of money would support whatever that transition looks like for the ethylene sector, which is dependent on the North Sea gas sector.
Grangemouth is an immediate priority for obvious reasons. The work that we're doing in Grangemouth will help inform the Just Transition Plan that I have already announced we're doing for Mossmorran. You know, the operators of Mossmorran, and I actually think it would have been, gosh, over a year ago, I had that discussion with them where they were open to work with us on a Just Transition Plan, but the immediate priority is Grangemouth. The learning of that Just Transition Plan for Grangemouth will help inform the Mossmorran Just Transition Plan. Those are active discussions, and I know that you've been having those discussions too. I also want to do a Just Transition Plan, you know, for Torness. You know, I've had early discussions with them about that. You know, I think for all these critical, large industrial sites, there should be a Just Transition Plan.
Okay. I just want to move then quickly on to another area. So it's welcome that the government announced in December the final circular economy of waste route map. There's lots of action in here for the coming year. Product stewardship plan, for example. Mandatory reporting of food waste was another thing we talked about with passage circular economy bill. Development of regional hubs for construction materials. You know, Cabinet Secretary will recognise all of these issues that came up throughout the passage of that bill. But is there adequate funding within the budget to enable each of those 11 strands, those 11 priorities to be progressed, you know, particularly given that, you know, there is still a challenge in relation to public sector funding and the capacity of councils to work together and to start to push on with some of these really urgent areas.
So, in terms of actual budget lines in my portfolio with regards to circular economy and zero waste, so zero waste activity is 23.2 million associated with that, and then there's Zero Waste Scotland's funding of 16.4 million as well. But in addition to that, I think I pointed to earlier, and I don't want to get this figure wrong, but I've pointed to an area in which local authorities were getting given funding for climate-related activities as well. Local authorities, of course, are also going to be receiving money as a result of EPR, which will allow them very significantly to work in dealing with their waste in a different way as a result of EPR funds, and indeed that the deposit return scheme will have an impact on being able to shift their capacity to other things as well. So it's not just a budget line in my portfolio with regards to the zero waste activity that's assisting with the rolling out of the route map and the activities associated with the route map, but there's also funding going to which COSLA asked for.
Right, but EPR, I mean, I understand it's not coming this year, is
no.
it? Right, so in terms of this year's budget, there's things in the route map that are specifically about action in 25-26. So I'll come back to my original question really about whether there is the resource to deliver on all of those projects that are time sensitive for this year that are listed.
The allocation that I've outlined is directly related to circular economy, and obviously spearheaded by Zero Waste Scotland, absolutely critical in delivering on quite a lot of that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'll get a couple of quick questions at the end, Cabinet Secretary. Nature Scott's budget appears to be cut, given the fact that we haven't reached our peatland restoration targets for 5 years. Do you feel that that's a wrong move and that we'll be able to meet our peatland restoration targets? The budget suggests that it'll be transferred in from some other fund. Which fund will lose it to get the peatland back up to the required standard?
Okay, so peatland restoration is funded by the Rural Affairs, so that Mary Gouchon has got the budget line associated with peatland restoration. I'm just having a look at some of the lines here on. I'm
looking at the gentleman on your left may know the answer.
I'm trying to find it.
So in terms of nature restoration, we've got 18 million from my portfolio for nature restoration. But you're right to point out that in terms of forestry and peatland restoration, that has a big impact on nature restoration. So if you look at it in the round, and obviously I've got the limited amount of detail on another person's portfolio, but we have got peatland restoration, an uplift of 32% in the peatland restoration budget, but that's Ms Gouchon's portfolio as well. And we have got 53 million for the forestry grant scheme, which I think is an increase of about 9 million as well.
Which was less than before. What I'm trying to work out is if the extra money's needed to meet the targets that you've set yourself, who's going to cough up which budget?
Dermot has some additional information.
So my understanding, I'll need to go away and double check this, but this morning before the meeting we had asked the question about, and my apologies, I can't remember if it was 9 or 18 million the figure was with Nature Scott, and actually that's not being reduced. That we found it from a programme funding somewhere else, but we can come back to the committee on it. But my understanding, if my memory is serving me correctly, is that reduction isn't going to take place in the area that you're talking about.
Okay.
Can we confirm that in writing to you?
I would like to see it in writing so I can just understand exactly where that's coming from. Yeah. The final question that I've got is on SEPA. SEPA's budget effectively stood still. Every time I see SEPA in front of this committee, they undertake to do something more than they're doing at the moment, and they're going to do it better. and they're going to do it with less staff. Well, they're going to have to, because my understanding is that the SEPA budget has effectively only been increased by 3%, which doesn't suggest an increase of staff. And then you suddenly hear about SEPA spending, you know, I think they're spending $650,000 on their their executive team, and then going out and franchising £100,000 worth of management consultants to come in to tell their management team how to do it better. I'm at a loss. Are you confident the SEPA's budget is going to be sufficient to allow them to take on all the extra work and rebuild their computer system, which is still pretty defunct?
So the government only funds 50% of SEPA's activities because they raise revenue for the other percentage as well. Operational decisions about how they spend that budget are for SEPA. And I mean, obviously, we want to see that the money that we give to them has been spent wisely, and we have those, you know, relationship with SEPA where we oversee how that's done and based on their business plan. But you know, forgive me if I don't jump into being the CEO of SEPA, that they're making decisions based on the budget they have. They have revenue generation capacity and capabilities, as well as the 50 million, 50.2 million that we're giving them in this budget.
Yeah, I understand they have revenue-raising ability, and the people that are paying that, of which I will quite honestly declare I am one, on the sense that I've got a abstraction from the River Spey, so I have to pay a licence for that as a farmer. You know, that's gone up considerably. All of it's gone up considerably. We're still seeing a 3% increase in their budget, and they've taken on more work. I have very grave concerns that they'll be able to do all the things that they should be doing. The fact that there have been more complaints to SEPA, less actual prosecutions in the last 5 years than ever before, would suggest that what I'm saying is correct, is it not?
Yeah. That's obviously an issue that's tangential to the budget. We want to make sure that, you know, Scotland's environmental quality is as it should be. They have assessed 87% of Scotland's water environment as having a high or good classification. We've got 66% of water bodies that are good ecological condition. We provide SEPA a grant from the Water Environment Fund as well for river basin management as well. Obviously, when there's public money going to SEPA, we want to see that it's done and it's improving environmental quality of Scotland. If that's not the case, then that is something that government discusses with SEPA, and of course it's something that the committee discusses with SEPA.
As indeed we tried to not too long ago, but I mean, I think the standard of Scotland's waterways is actually monitored by SEPA. It's not SEPA that directs the outcomes of those reports.
Yes, it's monitored by Scotland.
They're monitored, yes,
by
but they don't influence it with the money they spend. Douglas, you want a quick supplementary?
Quickly, Convener. I believe BIFA are suing the Scottish Government for £166 million over the deposit return scheme. If that was successful, would the money have to come out of the waste budget, or is there provision elsewhere for that?
I'm not going to comment on the live legal proceeding.
Let's try Mr Lumsden, but that's probably as far as that's going to go. Cabinet Secretary, do you want to say anything briefly before we bring this session to a close?
Just to say, there's a number of things that I'll follow up in writing with you where you need the detail. Again, another apology to Mr Doris, who I contradicted, and he was right. We do give an allocation to the Committee for Climate Change. I'll have the detail on what I think it's a couple of £100,000. We have it 368,000. So there we go. I've got it on the record, and apologies to him.
Thank you. I'm sure Mr Doris will be thankful for that correction to the record. There may be a follow-up to it that he now wants to ask.
No, Convener, one of the few occasions that I was actually correct, but if I can put that on the record, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm glad you put that on the record yourself, Mr Doris, and at that stage I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and her team for coming in to the committee. I'm going to move straight on to agenda item 5, which is the consideration, which doesn't involve you. Does it, Cabinet Secretary? It doesn't. What? No, it doesn't involve you. You looked at me concerned as if you were expecting... Well, Be unconcerned, it doesn't involve you. This is our next item is consideration of a negative instrument, the Financial Assistance for Environmental Purposes Variation Scotland Order 2024. The purpose of this order is to enable Scottish ministers to give financial assistance to any scheme, organisation or programme for the purposes of protecting, improving or gaining a better understanding of air quality. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul. No motions to annul have been lodged. Does any member have any comments on this? Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I would like to see more information about how these funds are to be used, particularly to support knowledge and action on the ground in relation to air quality. So, members will be aware that with the establishment of low emission zones in Scotland, the fines for low emission zones are now able to be spent on air quality management objectives within local authority areas. So there is a stream of funding there already. We know that the government is now working on its refreshed air quality plan, the Clean Air for Scotland 3. There's growing interest around particulate pollutants from wood-burning stoves in urban areas. There are new challenges which are emerging the whole time, and there's increased demands, I know, from the medical academics and professionals for monitoring of air quality, particularly around schools, because we know that children are particularly vulnerable to developmental issues in relation to air quality. So, I would like some more information about how these funds will be used, what the priority is going to be from government, particularly given the perspective of CAFS 3 coming through and the other funds that are available and some of the new emerging challenges on air quality that we've been party to in this committee and has been discussed in Parliament recently.
Thank you. Does any other member have any other comments? So, is the committee happy that we write a letter requesting further information from the government on how these funds are going to be used, but we have no other recommendations in relation to the instrument? We are agreed. We're now going to move into private.